Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video we're just going to be discussing the Hays Code and how it impacted lesbian representation on screen in the early to mid 20th century. The Hays Code is both a frightening and fascinating facet of cinematic history, not just because of the impact it had on on-screen lesbian representation, but the wider societal influence it wielded through its grip on the film industry. And when you compare productions containing lesbianism or lesbian subtext made outside the strict enforcement of the Hays Code to the ones made under it, the difference in the messaging around lesbianism and the light in which it is presented is just mind-blowing. So let's get into it. Now, I'm sure most of you already know this, but for those who don't, the Hays Code is actually an informal name for the Motion Picture Production Code, and it became known as the Hays Code because of a man called William Harrison Hays. But who was William Harrison Hays? William Harrison Hays was the first chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, a trade association founded in 1922 which represented film studios in the United States. As chairman of the MPPDA, Hays oversaw the dissemination of the Motion Picture Production Code. But what is the Hays Code? The Hays Code was a set of industry guidelines for the self-censorship of content that was applied to most motion pictures released by major studios in the United States from 1934 to 1968. It's important to note here that the code was actually adopted by the MPPDA in 1930, but it was not properly enforced until 1934, when the National Legion of Decency, an organisation dedicated to identifying objectionable content in motion pictures on behalf of Catholic audiences, was formed and threatened the film industry with church-led boycotts. For context, there were around 19 million Catholics and around 80 million Christians in the United States in 1930, out of a population of around 123 million. And these numbers explain why the threat of religious boycott posed such a serious issue for the film industry. The Hays Code was composed of a 19-page booklet that was co-written by Martin Quigley, who was a Catholic publisher of the Motion Picture Herald, and Father Daniel A. Lord, a Catholic priest. And it gave producers specific guidelines on what they could and could not show on film. And the code followed three general principles. Number 1, no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Number 2, correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Number 3, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. So the Hays Code essentially prohibited nudity, suggestive dances, discussions of sexual perversity, which included the portrayal of homosexuality, ridicule of religion, miscegenation, a term used to describe interracial relationships, lustful kissing, and scenes of passion. Pretty much everything the L word is composed of. The L word would not have been approved. So, from the code's general principles and prohibitions, it's notable how it served to not only preserve and promote racist, homophobic, and dogmatic religious ideals to the public, but it also severely limited creative expression and freedom of speech, which of course meant those religious ideals that the Hays Code was based around were not allowed to be questioned. So why was the code made? So in the early 1900s, both independent filmmakers and studios were able to rent their productions out to any theatre which would take it. Films with daring or shocking situations often resulted in more ticket sales, and therefore the morality in the content of these films became a secondary consideration to financial gain. Because films were able to reach large audiences, they were a mode mode of social influence, and as a result, the film industry threatened religious groups who had a vested interest in maintaining that societal influence for themselves. Therefore, these daring and shocking cinematic productions gave rise to criticism from both disgruntled religious groups and the public, which then resulted in legal censorship. It's also worth noting that from 1900 to the 1920s, the film industry was rapidly growing, with increasing capital tied into actors and studio properties. So therefore, it was agreed by studios and producers that they needed a trade association to protect their interests. This is when the MPPDA was formed and William Harrison Hayes became the president of it. In the 1920s, the MPPDA started to examine the content of pictures and discourage producers from buying the rights of questionable or controversial books and plays as source materials for movies. Producers generally adhered to the advice of the MPPDA up until 1926, when the shift from silent to talking pictures occurred. That is when the MPPDA was formed and William Harrison Hayes became the president of it. As a result of the shift, a studio relations committee was then formed to assist producers in their selection of stories and subsequent presentation of those stories on screen. But because the SRC generally had little to no power over the producers, they were regarded as purely advisory, and therefore their advice was often rejected. This once again started to cause problems with certain religious groups and elicited threats of boycotts. And that's when the MPPDA called upon Martin Quigley to assist in preparing the code. Now, it's important to note in relation to the topic of this video that even though the Hays Code was in place between 1930 and 1968, it was most heavily enforced between 1934 and 1952. In 1952, the code's influence on Hollywood and the film industry was weakened, or as I like to say, its first Horcrux was destroyed, because that's the year the lawsuit Joseph Bernstein Incorporated v. Wilson concerning the censorship of the Italian film The Miracle went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the judge decided that the film was in fact entitled to freedom of speech protections under the First Amendment, and this set the precedent for all other films after that. So that legal outcome from the Supreme Court in 1952, combined with the impact of television and the influence of foreign films upon the American film industry and public, all contributed to weakening the strict enforcement of the Hays Code. So when we look at films made and distributed under the Hays Code from 1930 to 1968, there is a noticeable difference in how lesbianism is presented or alluded to on screen before and after that period of very strict enforcement of the code between 1934 and 1952. So, how was the Hays Code enforced? The Hays Code had a system of enforcement with the Production Code Administration, which acted to compel Hollywood to follow the rules. The PCA fell under the umbrella of the MPPDA, and producers had to submit their ideas and scripts to the PCA for review, as well as the final prints of their films. If a film passed, it received a seal of approval which ran in the opening credits. If the PCA rejected a film, it was effectively barred from wide release, since all MPPDA members agreed not to produce or distribute any pictures which did not bear the PCA seal. In other words, if films didn't abide by the code, they would either not be made, or if they were somehow made, would not be distributed. Films that were not created under the code, particularly foreign films, would also be under immense pressure and pushback from religious groups, which would also hinder distribution. So how exactly did the Hays Code affect on-screen lesbian representation in the early to mid 20th century? We can see through the general principles and prohibitions of the code that it forbids portrayals of homosexuality. Homosexuality was not named as such in the code, but instead referred to as a corruption of sex. So the code states, sex perversion or any inference of it is forbidden. As a result of this, any explicit mention or portrayal of lesbianism was entirely erased from American cinema between 1934 and 1952. Of course, it's important to mention here that between the 1930s and the 1960s, when the Hays Code was in place, homosexuality was listed as a sociopathic personality disturbance for both men and women by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a handbook used by healthcare professionals in the United States. And not only was homosexuality seen as a mental disorder, up until anywhere between 1961 and 2003, homosexuality was an arrestable offence for men across most states. Now, whilst lesbianism was not an arrestable offence, it was still perceived as a mental disorder and as a moral ill. Women who were openly homosexual or suspected to be homosexual faced to lose their social standing, their employment, and in some cases their children. So being openly homosexual or being caught in a homosexual act carried grave consequences for both men and women. So all of that combined with the heavy religious influence on the guidelines in the Hays Code, it's no surprise that any promotion, sympathetic depictions, or any portrayal of homosexuality at all were a violation of the code and therefore banned. This is why homosexuality was only ever embedded in subtext or an implication in American cinema created under the strict enforcement of the Hays Code and never explicitly referred to or portrayed. Interestingly, before the strict enforcement of the code, there were a couple of American productions which featured explicit portrayals of lesbianism. The first was the 1922 film Manslaughter, which was considered to be a very debauched piece of work at the time. The lesbian kiss is not only explicit, but it's portrayed in a hedonistic light, rather than a satanic one. Interestingly, this is not dissimilar to some of the portrayals of heterosexuality in the film too. The second production is Queen Christina, which was released in 1933, which again not only depicted two women kissing in a romantic context, but normalised their relationship in the film too, which for a film produced in the 1930s is incredibly ahead of its time. Of course, there was also foreign films containing depictions of lesbianism distributed in the United States before the enforcement of the code too. One example of these films is Lesbian in Uniform, which had a limited release between 1932 and 1933. The film was almost banned in the US, but Eleanor Roosevelt spoke so highly of it that it managed to evade that ban and get distributed. Lesbian in Uniform is unique for that period in that it has a sympathetic portrayal of same-sex attraction, and the messaging around lesbianism is not inherently negative at all. However, it's important to note here that these three productions were created and distributed before the Hays Code was properly enforced. Hence why they were able to include those explicit depictions of lesbianism and portray lesbianism in a way that wasn't inherently associated with evil or mental instability. So it's unsurprising then that when the Hays Code began to be properly enforced in the 1930s and 1940s, that lesbian subtext in American cinema was most often found in the horror genre. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, the monsters and narrative in the horror genre are often allegorical, and it's a genre which is able to explore moral, spiritual, and political issues indirectly. And secondly, historically, it's a genre which has reinforced the church's narrative that homosexuality is sinful, a threat to society, and should be destroyed. Examples of this subtext subtext are present in productions such as Universal's Dracula's Daughter, a film released in 1936, which portrays elements of lesbianism through the allegory of vampirism. Now, the Hays Code censors at the time, headed by Joseph Breen, were well aware of the lesbian implications in Dracula's Daughter and worked to sanitize much of the film's content even before filming began. Even still, despite the work of the censors, the implications of same-sex desire in Dracula's Daughter are still very much detectable through the character of the Countess. And due to her monstrous nature, that desire is characterized as predatory and dangerous. The cinematography, the lighting, and the music all indicate to the audience that something bad is happening when the Countess is faced with Lily and showing signs of that desire. So, even if subtle, the lesbian subtext in Dracula's Daughter reinforces the religious ideals that the Hays Code is based upon, that same-sex desire is evil, unnatural, and something that needs to be defeated. Then you have a production such as Rebecca, which was released in 1940, also a part of the horror genre, that features the character of Mrs. Danvers, who is heavily implied to be a lesbian through her emotional attachment to Mr. De Winter's former wife, Rebecca. And throughout the film, there's also several implications that Rebecca was a lesbian or bisexual herself. Now, Mrs. Danvers' obsession with Rebecca is a focal point of the film's narrative, but any mention or explicit suggestion that Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca had a lesbian or romantic relationship was strictly prohibited by the censors. Similar to Dracula's Daughter, despite the censorship, the lesbian implications are still detectable through Mrs. Danvers' character, and the audience is encouraged to recognise this potential lesbianism as evil through not only the utilisation of unnerving music and visual choices, but also through Mr. De Winter's wife's disturbed reaction to her, and of course through the fact that Mrs. Danvers is established as an evil character. So once again, we can observe the associations between lesbianism and evil, which are threaded into Rebecca through Mrs. Danvers, complete with the destruction of her character, which is justified by her wickedness. Now, if we look at a production such as The Seventh Victim, released in 1943, yet another film in the horror genre, we can yet again see those same themes and implications in relation to the film's lesbian subtext. The Seventh Victim features the character of Jacqueline, who is heavily implied to be a lesbian through her broken marriage, disinterest in her husband, and connection to her hairdresser, Francis. Not only are both Francis and Jacqueline involved in a satanic cult, but Jacqueline is also suffering from poor mental health. So once again, we see lesbianism is associated with evil, with mental instability, and once again how it leads to despair and death. Through these cinematic productions created under the enforcement of the Hays Code, we can observe a clear pattern surrounding their portrayals of lesbian-coded characters and the messaging that these characters are synonymous with the unnatural, with mental instability, and with evil. And they are all righteously killed off as a result of these associations. Again, this is linked to the religious ideals that the Hays Code was based upon. This messaging served to propagate the church's narrative about homosexuality and reinforce negative connotations around it, all of which was absorbed consciously or subconsciously by audiences and worked to shape their views on homosexuals in real life, and even worse, shape the self-perception of homosexual women. Now, moving on to the 1950s, as discussed earlier, the 50s were a turning point for American cinema, due to film productions gaining legal protection under the First Amendment, meaning that there was more creative freedom which challenged political and religious ideals, including those about lesbianism. As a result, we can see a shift in the messaging and presentation of lesbian subtext and representation in cinema. The 1950s saw productions such as Calamity Jane being produced in 1953, and it's not so much the obvious lesbian subtext in Calamity Jane that makes it significant, as it is that Calamity Jane offered a positive source of representation for lesbians due to Calamity's gender nonconformity and otherness as a woman. The film in general plays with gender expression and sexuality in a very light-hearted way, which challenged the previous negative associations of other which had been strictly enforced by the Hays Code. The characters of Calamity and Katie very much represent a clear femme and butch lesbian aesthetic, which is reminiscent of certain lesbian relationship dynamics. And alongside this, Katie also moves in with Calamity and makes a home with her. So even if inadvertent and strictly relegated to subtext, the film does offer a source of representation for lesbians, and one that's not shrouded in despair and negative connotations, which is a significant change from the productions made under the strict enforcement of the Hays Code that we've previously discussed. It is important to mention here that huge social changes were taking place in 1950s America, which also contributed to this change in on-screen representation of women and lesbian-coded characters. The social landscape of 1950s America was still deeply homophobic, but it's also a period where the seeds of lesbian and gay activism was starting to grow. For example, the first lesbian civil and political rights organization in the United States, the Daughters of Bilitis, was formed in San Francisco in 1955. And alongside this, gender roles and expression were changing for women in this period as a direct result of World War II. Women were beginning to gain a lot more economic opportunities and independence. So a production such as Calamity Jane is as much a reflection of the changing social climate in 1950s America as it is a reflection of the Hays Code losing its oppressive grip on the film industry. The 1951 French film Olivia was also released in the USA in 1954, where it was released under the name The Pit of Loneliness. And the change in title for American audiences is interesting because it is thought to be a nod to the book The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, an incredibly famous lesbian novel which garnered a lot of publicity since it was published in 1928 and subsequently banned until 1949, where it was published again. So the name change was perhaps a marketing tactic through association to Hall's novel, or perhaps it was an attempt to elicit negative connotations to the lesbian content in the film, so that it didn't appear that the distributors were promoting homosexuality, since Olivia doesn't portray lesbianism in a particularly negative light. And Olivia is interesting because the lesbianism in it is both text and subtext. It's text due to the physical displays of desire, but it's also subtext since the lesbian relationships are mostly implied. The film does reinforce the associations between lesbianism and poor mental health. However, the messaging around same-sex romance is slightly more ambiguous and open to interpretation, as opposed to being condemned or portrayed as simply evil. Olivia is significant because even if its depiction of physical same-sex intimacy was censored in the US at the time, its overall portrayal of lesbianism is unique in that its lesbian characters were not punished for their feelings, nor were their feelings attached to negative connotations. Same-sex desire in the film was also not remedied by a righteous heteronormative ending either, all of which is observably different from the way lesbianism was portrayed in films created or distributed in the US under the strict enforcement of the code. Now, moving into the 1960s, the Hays Code is still technically in place, but again, much less stringently enforced due to a changing socio-political climate and lack of legal support, and as a result, we see a further shift in the messaging around and presentation of lesbianism on screen in American cinema in this decade, with lesbianism being portrayed in a more sympathetic light and framed in a way which encourages open interpretation from the audience, as opposed to it being inherently fused with evil or immoral connotations, which encourage the audience to associate it with something negative. It's also important to note here that in the 1960s, gay and lesbian activism was rapidly growing, and certain states across America began to actually decriminalize male homosexuality. And most significantly, the 60s were a decade which culminated in the Stonewall Uprising. And all of this is evidence of the magnitude of changing social perceptions around homosexuality within this period. Perhaps the biggest example of the Hays Codes we can state in the 1960s is through the 1961 production The Children's Hour. And this is because The Children's Hour explores the subject of homosexuality through a sympathetic lens. The film still taps into associations between lesbianism and tragedy, particularly with the lesbian character committing suicide, but all of the hatred and judgment stemming from homophobia is framed in a harmful light. And we see how this has a detrimental impact upon the lesbian character, who is framed in a sympathetic light. If we compare the messaging around homosexuality in The Children's Hour to how implications of homosexuality were treated in productions made under the strict enforcement of the Hays Code, you can see how monumental the shift in messaging surrounding it is. The next film to contain lesbian content distributed in the USA under the Hays Code is the remake of Maychen in Uniform in 1958, which was released in the United States in 1965, and features an explicit kiss, which is significant because, of course, it contains a physical portrayal of lesbianism, something that was explicitly banned in the Code's guidelines, and again, shows how little the Code and censorship surrounding lesbianism was being enforced during this point in time. Interestingly, even when looking at lesbian subtext within the horror genre in Western cinema in this period, such as the Italian production Blood and Roses, released in 1960, there's a noticeable change in the tone and messaging surrounding lesbianism too. Firstly, the romantic implications are much more explicit, but in the ending of Blood and Roses, there's a suggestion of romantic attachment between the two women, and that their relationship was more than just purely a monster and victim dynamic. Something that was very much absent in the genre before, which is interesting. It's worth noting here that even in the 1960s, with the exception of the Maychen in Uniform remake, all of the lesbian or lesbian-coded characters in cinematic productions were either killed or committed suicide. But the difference is, unlike before where it was justified, there's a moral uncertainty and dilemma around those deaths, which of course is a reflection of the changing societal perceptions and discourse surrounding homosexuality that was happening during this period. So what happened after the Hays Code? So the Hays Code was actually replaced with the MPAA film rating system. MPAA is an acronym for the Motion Picture Association of America, and it is used in the United States and its territories to rate a motion picture's suitability for certain audiences based on its content. The MPAA is now known as just the MPA, the Motion Picture Association Film Rating System. And the MPA rating system is actually a voluntary scheme that is not enforced by law. So films can be exhibited without a rating. Although most cinemas or theatres will refuse to exhibit non-rated films, since the ratings are there to protect children and to help parents know what is appropriate for their children or even themselves. The shift from the Hays Code to the MPA largely took place because it was becoming increasingly difficult to enforce the code on Hollywood productions due to a lack of legal support and a rapidly changing society and capitalist landscape. By the 1960s, the code was largely being ignored, and so the MPA realised that a classification system that informed audiences might work better than a censorship system that no one was adhering to anymore anyway. So how did the removal removal of the Hays Code affect on-screen lesbian representation? Post-Hays Code, we can observe a dramatic shift in on-screen lesbian representation in American cinema. Most obviously, there are much more explicit depictions of romantic relationships between two women, and studios took advantage of this newfound freedom, notably motivated by exploiting and hypersexualizing lesbianism for the male gaze and capitalist gain, which almost brings us full circle back to the beginnings of the film industry and that mindset of including daring or shocking aspects to a production, which homosexuality was, in order to make more money. Of course, the removal of the Hays Code didn't mean that there was an immediate influx of lesbian cinema which offered healthy and positive representation. Homophobia was still normalised in the 60s and all throughout the 70s. And although it was in the process of being decriminalised, it still wasn't embraced in society. During that period, gay and lesbian people could still very much lose their jobs. You could sue someone for accusing you of being gay or lesbian, and so on. Interestingly, films such as The Vampire Lovers, a British production which was financed by American money and released in 1971, and which featured explicit depictions of lesbianism, was initially asked by the British Board of Film Censors to remove its lesbian seduction scene. But in response, Hammer Film Productions replied that the lesbianism was not of their doing, but was present in the original Carmilla book that the film is based upon. And so the censors eventually backed down, but this attempt at censorship illustrates that there was still a reluctance and caution surrounding portrayals of explicit lesbianism on screen in the West, even with censorship being relaxed and homosexuality gaining increasing acceptance. The other notable aspect of on-screen lesbianism in the 1970s is, of course, the hypersexualization of lesbianism in cinema as a tool for gaining publicity and as a draw for audiences. And this exploitation of lesbianism extended beyond American productions. You have foreign films such as The Fox and The Killing of Sister George in 1968, Lay Begins in 1970, and The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant in 1972, all of which contain explicit depictions of lesbianism and female nudity, curated by male directors for the benefit of a heterosexual male audience. So, with the removal of the Hays Code and more relaxed censorship across Western societies and the film industry due to post-war liberalism, alongside the rise of gay and lesbian activism, on-screen lesbianism became much more explicit and expansive. However, as discussed, the type of representation and messaging around lesbianism was still impacted by what producers and investors were willing to fund, and by a male-dominated industry, and where the Hays Code encouraged either a negative view of lesbianism or the erasure of it entirely, the subsequent hypersexualization of lesbianism after its removal also impacted lesbians in a negative way, because their sexuality was being presented as something for male benefit, and this was often presented alongside those same immoral and mentally ill associations it had under the Hays Code, distorting it even further. It wasn't until the arrival of Desert Hearts in 1985, a film which was made on an independently raised budget of just $350,000, with Donna Deitch eventually selling her own house to cover production costs, that there was any real change in the distorted and negative portrayals of lesbianism being regurgitated in cinema, or that there was any authenticity to on-screen lesbian representation in cinema at all. Desert Hearts is a significant production because it not only challenged all of the previous tropes and negative perceptions around lesbianism, it also gave its lesbian couple an open ending with a possibility of happiness, which in turn offered a positive source of representation for the lesbian community and began to offer a different narrative and perspective, which would go on to shape societal perceptions of lesbians for the better. So it is a significant milestone in lesbian cinema, not only because it was a turning point for on-screen lesbian representation, but for what it represented to lesbians in real life, a ray of hope. For me, this film is what truly marks the end of the shadow that was cast upon the film industry in regards to on-screen lesbian representation by the creation of the Hays Code. The evil is defeated. And this shift in on-screen lesbian representation only went on to improve. With the technological advancement and accessibility of filming equipment across the 80s and 90s that put the possibility of filmmaking back into the hands of the individual, including female and lesbian filmmakers, therefore diminishing the male-dominated and bigger studios' overarching grip on the film industry. And from there on out, as they say, girl, the rest is history. So overall, it's really interesting to see how portrayals of on-screen lesbianism in cinema were impacted by censorship, law, patriarchy, and religion in the 20th century, and in what ways those portrayals reflect and have shaped the socio-legal landscape surrounding homosexuality in the West. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts on this topic, let me know down in the comments section below. Maybe leave me the director's clapboard emoji too, you know, just so I know that you are ride or die. You're with me till the end. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!